Hello and welcome to another episode of Sermon Braindump. My name is Scott Dalen. I'm an ELCA pastor in Southwest Iowa, and I present these videos weekly for a couple different reasons. The first of which is to take my brain out of the motor background work over the course of the week and move into the process of writing and preparing the sermon I will preach to my congregation for the weekend. That's the first reason I do these. And the second is just to allow you, the viewer, who have come across this video for whatever reason brought you here today, whether you are a first-time viewer who have just stumbled across this, in which case welcome, or if you are a long-time viewer, maybe even a subscriber, for which I am grateful, just to allow you to gain some insight into the assigned text for the week. So that is why I do these. This particular Sunday, which is October 20th, 2019, the 19th Sunday after Pentecost. A quick note, the assigned gospel, which is what I usually talk about, comes out of Luke chapter 18, verses 1 through 8, back into parables again, which if you've been following along, you know we've had a lot of parables lately. This one is the parable of the unjust judge and the widow that Jesus shares. However, I am not planning on preaching on this one this time around. If you are interested in some insights into that particular text, 3 years ago I did preach on it, and I have got an entire brain dump on that one. That is episode number 121. If I think about it, I'll throw a link to that one down into the comments area. So you can jump to that one if you are looking for insights into the parable of the unjust judge. But instead, this time around, I'm jumping back into the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Scriptures, which is a better way of saying it, all the way back into Genesis, the first chapter, or not chapter, the first book of the Bible, and looking at Genesis 32, verses 22 through 31. This is known as the episode, or the moment, or the story, whatever we want to call it, when Jacob wrestles with God through the night, which results in a blessing from God and a change in identity. And that is the one that I'm going to focus in on. But this is a very small part, excuse me, of Jacob's larger story. And really how Jacob fits in with the story of the initial patriarchs. So if you're familiar with the patriarchs, you kind of know who I'm talking about. If you're not, we begin with Abraham. It's oftentimes called Father Abraham. Abraham was a random dude who God pretty much started talking to and said, I want you to go. I will tell you when you get there. And by the way, even though your wife is barren, you will have children and you will have descendants like the stars in the sky. Makes the promise. Abraham believes him, and it's credited as righteousness. So Abraham is the first patriarch. Eventually, Abraham has children when he gets very, very old. First, he ends up having a son with his wife's servant, or his wife's slave. That's Ishmael, and by all rights, Ishmael, as the oldest son, should have been the one to receive the blessing and the inheritance and all of that from his father, and his father was quite rich when he died. That's not what ended up happening. Down the road, a few years later, God fulfilled the promise with Abraham's wife Sarah. She conceived and bore Isaac. So Isaac is the younger brother, and yet he is the one that received the blessing. Now, Isaac grew. And if you're familiar with that story, there's a lot going on there as well. When Isaac was fully grown, he married his wife Rachel, and eventually, even though they dealt with her being barren as well, eventually she did conceive, and she had twins, Esau and Jacob. Esau was born first, therefore is the oldest son and the one who should have gotten, again, the inheritance and the blessing and all of that. But the interesting thing about Jacob, or in the Hebrew, I'm probably going to pronounce this wrong, but it's Jacob, which means he who grasps the heel, or he who comes along behind. And so it basically means he's shrewd and he's a trickster. They literally name him that. Because when Esau is born, Jacob is holding his heel, and then Jacob is born. So Jacob is the younger son, even though they're twins. As they grow, Jacob reveals himself to be quite the trickster. He cheats Esau first out of his birthright and then out of the blessing. He fools Isaac, their father, who is quite old and blind by this time. Then he runs away, fleeing from the wrath of his brother. Goes to his uncle Laban, his mother's brother. Um, Laban kind of swindles him in terms of the work that Jacob does to earn the right to marry his daughter. Fools him, marries him off to another daughter, and then he has to work another 7 years, 14 years total, to then marry the daughter that he wanted to. But it goes back and forth. Jacob also, it could be argued that he's got some divine insight and somehow he swindles his uncle in terms of his wages, how he gets rich or wealthy through the growing of his herds, through the way that he receives payment through the birth of different livestock from his uncle. So that's going around, but essentially, he's finally once Jacob becomes gets older. He has 2 wives. He also has 2 maidservants, or essentially concubines. He has 12 sons, a whole bunch of daughters, and he's going to go back to his brother Esau. And that is where they're going as we get to this point today. Gosh, I've talked for over 6 minutes and we haven't even gotten to the scripture yet. But Jacob is afraid of his brother, so he continues to try and be tricky. He divides his entire camp into 2 different locations, thinking, well, if my brother comes out to kill me, he'll attack one camp, but the other one will survive. Because Esau is coming with 400 men, and Jacob doesn't know, is he coming to attack me or is he coming to greet me? He didn't know. And then as they're going, he then puts his wives and children in front, along with a whole bunch of offerings of gifts of livestock and such that he's sending. And then finally, they all go in front of him, and then he's going to come alone. So we kind of continue to see this. Jacob's like, I'm going to put as much distance between me and Esau as possible so I can see what he's going to do at the expense of other stuff, if necessary. So all that has happened, and now he's at this river, and that's where we pick up today. Holy smokestack. Sorry, I've talked a long time to give the backstory of Jacob. That same night, Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 maids, his 11 children, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream, and likewise everything that he had. Jacob was left alone, and the man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw he could not prevail against Jacob, he struck him on the hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, let me go, for the day is breaking. But Jacob said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. So he said to him, what is your name? And he said, Jacob. Then the man said, you shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans and have prevailed. Then Jacob asked him, please tell me your name. But he said, why is it that you ask my name? There he blessed him. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, for I have seen God face to face, and yet my life was preserved. The sun rose upon him as he passed Penuel, limping because of his hip. So that's it. All right. So we've got this divine wrestling match. Now, there's a lot of different thoughts about where this story came from. There's similar myths in some other cultures, and they think maybe that this was applied to Jacob because Jacob then becomes Israel, as we hear. He receives this blessing and this new identity from some divine being, whether it's an angel or some think that it could even be a demon, or like a water demon that he's fighting. Some think it's God. There's a lot of different ideas of who is this being that Jacob is wrestling with. But regardless, sorry, phone's buzzing over there. So he strives all night with this being, wrestling and wrestling and wrestling, and somehow it wrenches his hip out, and so there's an injury, there is a mark, if we want to call it that, in this striving with God. But there's the new identity. His name is changed from Jacob, which, as I said before, means grasping the heel or coming along behind, or trickster, and it becomes Israel, which means he strives with God, or he wrestles with God. Now this is interesting, and it gives some insight into where does the name of the nation Israel come from. Jacob eventually, here we hear he's only got 11 sons. His youngest son hadn't been born yet. But through his second to youngest son, Joseph, who eventually gets shipped off to Egypt, and the family eventually down the road follows him there. That's how they end up in Egypt, and then they grow from this one family into the entire nation over the course of 400 years, and that's where Exodus picks up. But because of them, this is where the name Israel comes from. So the identity stems from this one guy who is the third patriarch, and kind of yet again continues that story of God using the one that should not be the right one, and definitely in his case, because he's a trickster and he's pretty much cheated everybody he's come in contact with, and he's gotten rich out of it, and yet this is the one that God eventually uses. So what do we take from this, and why am I focusing in on this one? Well, the idea of wrestling with God or striving with God, that I think is important to recognize, that we have times in our life of faith when things just don't quite make sense, when things happen that we can't make sense of, or when it just sort of seems like, God, I'm asking for help on this and I don't seem to be getting an answer, or I don't understand this and this doesn't quite line up and I can't make heads or tails of it. All these different things. Maybe it's our encounters with Scripture, or maybe it's what's happening in our lives, the situation that surrounds us, or what happens to people that we know. All these different things. Maybe we wrestle with it and we have a hard time with it, and that's not a bad thing. I've often said that I don't think doubt within our life of faith is a bad thing. Our faith can stand up to questions. God can stand up to questions. We see that in the Psalms, and I know I've talked about this before, but the Psalms are prayers, and they are very honest about the state of life. That often a lot of the Psalms, the single biggest batch of Psalms out of the 150 Psalms, are laments. Most of them are laments, or the largest number of them are laments, compared to Psalms of joy or Psalms of celebration. Those are in there too, but lament is in there. Asking that question, how long, God? Or what is this? Or what is this about? So I think that that's okay to acknowledge that that's a part of our life of faith. It doesn't mean that we're being unfaithful when we ask those questions of God, when we strive or when we wrestle with God. The entire nation of Israel was based on that. But the other side of it, the other side of this story, I think is important too. So the blessing is given to Jacob after he spends this time wrestling with this divine being, and he is named Israel. So he has this new identity, and likewise we receive a new identity from God, and that's beloved child of God. We are claimed by God, and we have that. But it leaves a mark upon us. Just like his hip was wrenched, we are changed by this encounter with God and this new identity that God gives us. So that's really kind of what I'm taking from this story. It might seem very face value. Admittedly, I didn't dive deep into the background exegetical work that I normally do. I was planning on preaching out of Luke, and then a conversation that I've had in about the last 24 hours has sort of changed my mind on that. But that's okay. If you happen to catch my video from last week, I was kind of getting into some heavy stuff. The sermon from last week turned very, very heavy for my congregation and heavy for me to preach it. And so this week we've had a challenge, and I kind of want to follow that up with some encouragement. And I think that the encouragement that we find here in this story of Jacob is a good one. So a lot of background work to remind us that God acts in ways that we don't often anticipate, and often in the lives of those that we really don't anticipate. But that there's a good example for us there. If you have thoughts, questions, comments, you want to throw them down in the comment section, we'll continue the conversation that way. Otherwise, as always, if you appreciate these videos and you think that they are a benefit, and you would like to support the ministry that allows me to do them, I will put a link to my congregation's website down in the comment section. You can follow that and support it financially. And I do want to say thank you to one of my viewers out there, because you did that, and that's huge. That's very much appreciated by both me, but also by my congregation. So if anyone else wants to, please do so, but no pressure to do so if not. I hope you have a blessed week. We'll catch you next time.